Ethan Blake sank into the creaking wooden chair at his kitchen table, the early morning light filtering through lace curtains and casting a soft glow on the pile of unopened mail. He reached for the top envelope, its heavy cardstock and official seal, signaling something more serious than a charity solicitation or overdue bill. He sliced open the flap and unfolded the crisp paper inside. As he read the summons, his pulse quickened. Jury duty. The words felt both ordinary and astonishing, like an invitation to step onto a stage he had never auditioned for and could not refuse. He set the notice beside his untouched mug of coffee, the steam curling into the air unheeded. Teaching American history to eager high school students had always been his passion. But now he found himself cast in a living courtroom drama and he had only ever studied from textbooks. He pictured the mahogany benches, the solemn rows of faces waiting to dispense justice, and he wondered how he might measure up under the scrutiny of stern judges and probing attorneys. Doubt flickered through him. Did he possess the composure to weigh witness testimony, the patience to sit through testimony that might run long and heated? His mind drifted to the routine of his everyday life. He imagined the stack of essays on the dining room counter, the lesson plans for a lesson on the Founding Fathers, and the afternoon coaching session he had promised at the middle school. Who would cover his classes while he fulfilled this civic obligation? The thought tightened his chest, yet beneath the worry, there was a quiet thrill. Here was a chance to participate in the very process that undergirded the ideals he taught each day. The right to a fair trial, the responsibility of ordinary citizens to safeguard justice. And he closed his eyes and let himself drift back to his teenage days, when he had first set foot in a courtroom to observe a neighbor's trial. The hush of the witness stand, the gravity in the judge's voice, the curious mix of fear and hope in those who waited to hear a verdict. All of it had left an indelible mark on him. He had vowed then to serve should the opportunity arise, but he never imagined that moment would come at such an unpredictable time. Setting the summons aside, Ethan rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Neighborhood children bicycled past, their laughter bright against the distant hum of traffic. A tabby cat sauntered along the fence, pausing to rub against a rosebush. The world he knew remained peaceful and familiar, even as his own path was about to diverge into unfamiliar territory. He reached for his coat and allowed himself a moment of resolve. Jury duty was more than an obligation. It was a chance to live the principle he had spent years explaining in classrooms. With a steadying breath, Ethan straightened his tie and set off toward the courthouse, each step echoing with the weight of expectation and the promise of a role he had never sought, but could now embrace with all his quiet determination. Ethan arrived at the courthouse just as the mellow light of mid-morning filtered through the tall, arched windows lining the waiting room. The marble floors gleamed beneath rows of wooden benches, each polished curve and carved detail speaking of centuries of solemn proceedings. He took a seat among a crowd of other prospective jurors, men and women of different ages, races, and professions, most dressed with the quiet respect one reserves for places of law and order. A low hum of conversation drifted through the hall. Soft laughter from college students summoned for their first duty, polite murmurs between retirees who treated this as a civic gathering, and distracted glances from parents mentally juggling work and family obligations. When the courtroom doors were finally opened, a bailiff called names in a calm, authoritative voice. Ethan's heart fluttered as he rose and followed a small procession down the corridor, passing portraits of stern-faced judges and banners proclaiming justice, liberty, and the rule of law. Inside the courtroom itself, sunlight streamed through high windows, casting long, warm stripes of illumination across the polished wood of the jury box. The air was tinged with the faint scent of old paper, varnish, and the slightly antiseptic tang of the bench. Ethan chose a seat near the middle, settling in just as the judge entered, robed in black, carrying the weight of centuries of precedent in every measured step. The lawyers for both sides began the voir dire process with practiced efficiency. They explained the case in broad strokes: a manslaughter trial arising from an industrial accident, and then launched into questions designed to expose biases and life experiences that might color each juror's perspective. Ethan listened intently as the prosecution probed for attitudes toward labor disputes, corporate responsibility, and community safety regulations. Each question felt like a delicate balance. Too passionate an answer, and one risked seeming prejudiced. Too guarded, and one could appear unengaged. When the defense attorney asked if anyone had ever worked in a factory or feared for their own safety on the job, Ethan's hand shot up. He had taught history in a vocational technical school and had seen firsthand the tension between management and workers. The attorney nodded thoughtfully, jotting a note before moving on. One by one, jurors were questioned in a pattern that became almost hypnotic. A name called, a few rapid-fire inquiries, a brief exchange, and then the hopeful relief of remaining seated, or the disappointed shuffle back to the gallery. Ethan watched his neighbors breathe a little easier when allowed to stay and lean forward with interest whenever a question related to his background or beliefs. When his name was finally called, he stood, rubbing the back of his neck with a slight grin. He answered each question in full sentences, his teacherly habit of clarity and detail coloring every response. He spoke of his respect for due process, of his belief that every story deserved to be heard, and of the importance of balancing empathy with objectivity when weighing evidence. But then came the moment he had dreaded. The prosecutor's eyes, cool and calculating, studied Ethan's face, pausing as if calibrating his worth to the case. Ethan felt the weight of that gaze, imagined the silent questioning behind it. Would this gentleman tilt the verdict toward corporate leniency? Did his background as an educator make him too sympathetic to the factory owner, who was a pillar of the local economy? The prosecutor rose, approached the bench, and quietly exercised a peremptory challenge. The judge offered no explanation, but her nod was unmistakable. Ethan's seat was ceded to another hopeful juror, waiting in the gallery. He collected his belongings in stunned silence, the echo of his chair scraping the floor, sounding unnaturally loud in the hush that followed. Returning to the public benches, he passed the fresh faces of those still under consideration. Faces full of tension, of hope, of uncertainty. Sitting down, Ethan felt a swirl of emotions. Relief to be free of the uncertainty. Frustration at the implication that his viewpoint was unwanted, and a sudden curious urge to see how the story would play out without his voice. From this vantage point, removed from the jury box, yet closer than ever to the unfolding drama, he resolved to pay attention to every witness, every tactic, every hesitation, as though he were shaping the outcome in absentia. By the time the judge adjourned for recess, Ethan found himself leaning forward, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the empty jury box. Though dismissed, he could not shake the sense that his duty was not yet over. The threads of justice, so carefully laid out in the courtroom's ornate architecture, still beckoned him to bear witness. And so he stayed ready to watch, analyze, and learn, driven by the unshakable belief that every trial, like every history lesson, demands an engaged and open mind. From the vantage point of the public gallery, Ethan watched the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. The defendant sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped and hands clasped tightly before him, fingers white-knuckled against dark wood. He was a broad-shouldered man in work-stained overalls, the type Ethan recognized from the factory where he sometimes chaperoned student visits. There was nothing inherently frightening about him. Rather, he seemed exhausted, as though the weight of months' worth of anxious anticipation pressed down upon his very spine. The first witness, a co-worker, took the stand under the bright courtroom lights. She spoke in a trembling voice of that fateful afternoon when the accident occurred, describing the loud bang and the cries for help echoing off the warehouse walls. She insisted the defendant had been careless, that he ignored the warning sirens and bypassed safety interlocks. Yet as she recounted every anguished detail, Ethan's teacher's mind drifted to the factory safety manual he had once helped students dissect. He recalled passages about alarm delays and override procedures, details the prosecution had glossed over entirely. The witness's description felt incomplete, like a half-painted portrait missing its defining strokes. Next came the factory manager, impeccably dressed and polished, who praised the plant's safety record and claimed the incident was an unforeseeable tragedy. His testimony was smooth, rehearsed, each phrase carefully enunciated to sidestep uncomfortable truths about years of deferred maintenance. He spoke of routine inspections and state compliance certificates, yet avoided any mention of the plant's aging conveyor belts or the persistent budget cuts that forced workers to risk their own safety. Ethan leaned forward, straining to catch the manager's subtle hesitation when referencing the inspection log that had inexplicably gone missing. That falter, brief though it was, stood out starkly against the man's otherwise unflappable demeanor. As the day wore on, Ethan noted that the jury remained impassive. They scribbled diligently in their notebooks, yet their faces betrayed no sign of the shock or sympathy he felt at the prospect of a life altered by mechanical failure. When the plaintiff's attorney called the industrial safety expert, Ethan braced himself for clarity. But the expert spoke in dense technical jargon, invoking statistical probabilities rather than human costs. He described stress fractures in metal beams and tolerances within fraction of an inch margins, reciting formulas that drifted past the jury like ghostly equations. Only once did his measured tone waver, when a juror asked whether workers had received proper training on emergency shutdown procedures. The expert brushed the question aside, stating it was beyond the scope of his analysis. During recess, Ethan found himself unable to depart. He wandered the marble foyer with his mind racing, replaying snippets of testimony and wondering how many pivotal questions had gone unasked. The factory worker's fate seemed sealed by a narrative shaped more by polished rhetoric than unvarnished facts. He returned to the gallery at the very moment the judge called the courtroom to order for the afternoon session, taking his seat in the very row where he had been swept from the jury box just days before. In the afternoon, the defense attorney presented his own witnesses, a friend of the defendant who spoke of his impeccable record and responsible character, a union representative who testified that workers had frequently complained of poorly maintained equipment, and a safety consultant who lamented the company's refusal to invest in modern guards and sensors. Each voice added texture to the story, yet the jurors' expressions remained inscrutable. They leaned back, arms folded as if waiting for some final element to tip the scales. It was during cross-examination that Ethan felt his heart beat fastest. The defense lawyer asked the production supervisor a simple, piercing question. Why had urgent orders from the board forced employees to bypass safety protocols in order to meet deadlines? The supervisor sputtered, flustered by the unexpected line of inquiry, and admitted that directives from higher-ups had created an atmosphere where speed trumped safety. The courtroom gasped, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan glimpsed doubt flicker across the jurors' faces. But the prosecutor quickly interjected, steering the conversation back to the defendant's individual responsibility. The moment passed, and the momentum shifted once more in favor of the state's narrative. As witnesses were excused and the gavel signaled the end of testimony, Ethan felt an ache of frustration. The jury was about to retire behind closed doors, armed only with the version of events the courtroom had allowed them to hear. He realized then that his dismissal from service had cost the trial a voice that might have pressed for vital clarifications. Rising from his seat, he resolved to remain an eager, critical observer, to memorize every detail of contradiction and oversight, because if no juror would question the gaps and silences, then someone had to carry the truth forth. In that moment, the history teacher in him awoke fully, prepared to step beyond recorded facts and into the heart of justice itself. The courtroom felt oppressively still as the judge's gavel fell to signal the start of closing arguments, and Ethan sat up straighter in the public gallery, every muscle taut with anticipation. He could sense the jurors shifting on the bench, bracing themselves for the final framing of the story they would carry into the jury room. The prosecution rose first, delivering a polished summary that replayed the most damning moments of the accident footage, emphasized the co-worker's tear-choked testimony, and painted the defendant as negligent to the point of criminal recklessness. The The prosecutor's words were carefully measured, each phrase chosen to underscore a narrative of personal failure, as though machines and maintenance schedules had played no part in the tragedy. Ethan watched the jurors, their pens scratching across yellow pads, their eyes trained on the prosecuting attorney, with an expression that suggested they had already accepted his version of events. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of collective judgment. Frustration boiled in Ethan's chest. He felt as though he were clothed in water, each inhalation stinging with the knowledge that vital evidence had gone unexamined, that factory safety logs had been glossed over, that critical questions about who had overridden safety alarms that very afternoon remained unasked. When the defense attorney rose, his tone was more measured, more intimate in its appeal. He acknowledged the tragic loss of life, but insisted upon context. The broken machinery, the absence of timely repairs, a company culture that squeezed every ounce of production at the expense of basic human safeguards. He cited the union rep's account of whispered safety complaints, and he boldly challenged the credibility of the factory manager's missing inspection records. A hush fell over the room as he pressed his finger against the grain of the courtroom's polished wood lectern, construing a portrait of a man caught between loyalty to his job and instincts for caution. A man no more deserving of harsh condemnation than any other worker forced into impossible choices. But as his words echoed through the hall, Ethan felt the jurors' expressions flicker from engaged curiosity back to polite detachment. The defense's impassioned plea, though compelling, seemed to fade against the prosecutor's earlier drumbeat of personal responsibility. Ethan's mind raced. How had the context of plant-wide negligence, the pressure of looming deadlines, and the subtleties of human error been allowed to slip through the cracks? Why had no juror asked the factory inspector why his log was conveniently misplaced, or why the safety consultant's voice, muted in technical jargon, had never been given room to speak plainly about the risk that had long gone unaddressed? When the judge began to recite the standard instructions, reminding jurors to consider only testimony admitted into evidence to avoid sympathy or prejudice, Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his throat. He imagined the jury room door closing, sealing in a verdict shaped by incomplete truths. In that moment, he understood something profound. The machinery of justice was not self-correcting. It required vigilant participants prepared to challenge omissions, to press for inconsistencies, to demand that every relevant fact see the light of day. As the courtroom clerk handed out sealed envelopes containing the verdict forms, Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He knew that once the jury retreated to deliberate, the chance to reshape the narrative would vanish. His breath caught in his chest as the judge invited the jurors to follow the bailiff. A scattered scratching of pens ceased. An expectant silence enveloped the benches. Ethan felt the walls of the gallery close in, and for an instant the room felt smaller, colder, as though every stone pillar and carved bench pressed him down with a weight of unspoken evidence. A fierce urgency rose within him, the conviction that, unless new light was cast upon the hidden corners of this case, the verdict would be a hollow victory for justice. He recalled the hollow ring of the safety consultant's words, the manager's subtle flinch when asked about repairs, the jurors' blank faces as the stakes of corporate culpability were laid bare yet unheard. Quietly, resolutely, Ethan vowed that he would not remain a passive witness. He would find a way, before that jury rendered its verdict, to force those neglected truths into the heart of the courtroom's deliberations. The courtroom buzzed with a tense energy as the final morning of the trial dawned, sunlight filtering through tall windows and dust motes dancing in the heavy air. Ethan arrived early, slipping into a gallery seat well before spectators filled the benches. He watched the jury filing in, their faces composed but grave, each juror carrying the weight of responsibility that awaited them. At the front, the defendant sat stiffly in his chair, shoulders squared against a storm of uncertainty. The judge took her place and offered a curt nod, signaling the parties to prepare their last words. The prosecutor stood first, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor as he approached the lectern. He spoke with measured authority, replaying the chilling details of the accident in vivid terms. The shriek of metal under strain, the sudden surge of steam, the panicked cry that echoed down the warehouse aisles. His voice rose and fell like a conductor's baton, guiding the jury through a tightly woven tapestry of blame. He painted the factory worker as reckless, as someone who had flouted basic safety in pursuit of shortcuts, and he insisted that the law must hold him accountable. As Ethan listened, he sensed how the rhythmic certainty of the argument swept over the jurors, imprinting itself like a mantra, guilt beyond a shadow of doubt. When the prosecutor sat down, nods rippled through the courtroom. The air felt thick with expectation as the defense attorney rose to offer his summation. He began softly, acknowledging the profound loss and pain caused by the incident, and he spoke of the defendant's steady work record and devotion to his family. He reminded the jurors of the expert testimony about worn machinery and deferred maintenance, urging them to see the accident as the tragic outcome of systemic failures as much as individual actions. Yet his words seemed to falter under the weight of the prosecutor's dramatic flourish. The jury's stoic expressions betrayed little sign of having been moved by this appeal to context and compassion. Ethan watched the jurors closely during the defense's address, their pens continuing to trace lines across yellow pads, their eyes momentarily flicking to witness statements but returning quickly to the attorney's suit jacket and the bright glare of the room. He felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. In every sentence, he heard the unsaid omissions. No mention of the safety consultant's warning, no inquiry into missing inspection logs, no acknowledgement of the company's tacit pressure on employees to ignore alarm bells. The machinery outside of this man's control had been reduced to background noise, while the broad strokes of personal responsibility had been magnified into a damning portrait. When the judge rose to give her instructions, the finality of the moment crashed over Ethan like a wave. She reminded the jurors to base their verdict solely on the evidence presented, to weigh each testimony with impartial care, to resist sympathy or bias. Yet in that admonition, Ethan detected the unspoken truth. Once the jury retired, the chance to revisit overlooked facts would vanish. The clerk passed out sealed verdict forms. Ethan saw the jurors inhale collectively, as if steeling themselves for a verdict they believed had already been decided. Heart pounding and palms slick with sweat, Ethan rose from his seat with a determination he had not felt since stepping into that jury box days ago. He felt the gravity of the moment more keenly than ever before. A man's fate balanced precariously on the outcome of deliberations shaped by partial history. He knew that silence would mean surrendering justice. Gathering every ounce of courage, he stood in the aisle, voice building in urgency as he called out to the judge, asking to speak before the jury's door closed. The courtroom fell silent in startled disbelief, and in that fragile hush, Ethan realized that to protect the integrity of the process, he must risk everything, and that the final act of his unexpected jury service was only just beginning. The moment the bailiff's heavy door swung shut behind the assembled jurors. A hush fell over the courtroom so sudden it felt like a held breath. Spectators shifted in their seats, glancing at one another in muted surprise. Closing arguments complete, jury deliberations imminent. And yet something still pulsed between these walls, an unfinished chapter demanding attention. Ethan rose from his spot among the gallery, his heart pounding as if trying to break free. Every fibre of his being trembled with a single urgent purpose. He could not, would not, stand aside while a verdict was delivered on an incomplete story. His voice, when it finally emerged, was calmer than he felt. "Your Honor," he called, stepping into the aisle. The judge, perched behind a bench, raised an eyebrow, a gavel poised in midair, as she stared down at him in astonishment. "May I speak before the jury retires?" Ethan's words echoed across the polished wood floor, and a rippling murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor's brow furrowed and the defense attorney leaned forward, eyes narrowing as he recognized the authority implicit in Ethan's request. Any person, under certain circumstances, could be heard if their testimony might affect a just outcome. For a heartbeat, the judge's stern visage held the weight of procedure and tradition. Then, as if acknowledging a higher call of conscience, she lowered her gavel and inclined her head. "Mr. Blake," she said, voice formal, but not unkind. "You may approach the bench." The courtroom released its held breath in a collective exhalation. Eyes followed Ethan as he crossed the floor, the hush wrapping around him like a cloak. He passed the jury box, where the door stood ajar, the faint shuffle of deliberation drifting through its frame. He would speak directly to the judge, to the silent jurors beyond that threshold, and to the very soul of justice itself. Standing before the bench, Ethan drew in a steadying breath. He spoke with measured clarity, each word chosen from the deep well of his teacher's training and his own mounting conviction. He recounted the missing fragments of the trial, the safety consultant whose sober analysis of worn conveyor belts had been buried beneath technical jargon, the factory manager's hesitant admission that inspection logs had gone missing, the union representative's plea for better training, overlooked in favor of a narrative that emphasized personal blame. He painted a vivid portrait of a system that had leaned on an individual while conveniently ignoring the larger machine that had faltered first. As he spoke, he sensed a palpable shift in the courtroom's atmosphere, a stirring of conscience that transcended roles and ranks. The judge listened, her expression thoughtful, as Ethan laid out his evidence in quiet but compelling detail, urging that the jury be granted the opportunity to consider these vital truths. The prosecutor's initial frown softened into a reluctant nod. Even he could see the force of logic and moral imperative that Ethan's words carried. The defense attorney exchanged a brief, astonished glance with his client, as if acknowledging that the integrity of the trial hung in the balance. At last, the judge tapped her bench gently with a gavel. "This court finds Mr. Blake's testimony material to the interests of justice," she proclaimed, voice ringing with solemn authority. The jury is ordered to reconvene for further deliberations in light of this new information. In that extraordinary moment, the courtroom, a place bound by precedent, protocol, and the measured cadence of gavels, found itself repurposed as an arena for the fundamental right to be heard. News of the judge's decision rippled beyond the walls. Reporters later described it as unprecedented. Community members called it a triumph of conscience. And jurors themselves would speak of the weight lifted when they were allowed to weigh every relevant fact. But in that hushed courtroom, with Ethan Blake returning to his seat and the jury filing back into the box, the grander truth took shape. Justice is not merely the outcome of procedure, but the living commitment to seek every shard of truth. No matter how inconvenient, until the scales finally balance. When the jury filed back into the box, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as though a fresh current of possibility had swept through the air. The jurors slid into their seats with quiet determination, their expressions no longer expectant but inquisitive. Outside, a low murmur rippled among the gallery, neighbors leaning forward, reporters exchanging excited glances. Yet within the box itself, a hushed focus prevailed. The judge, seated once more behind her bench, offered a slight nod toward the closest bailiff, who began distributing blank sheets for recording the verdict. Ethan sat rigidly in his gallery seat, heart pounding as he watched the jurors confer. Through the narrow gap of the open door, he could see them lean toward one another, brows furrowed in concentrated dialogue. He recalled each point he had urged them to consider. The rattling conveyor belts, the faded safety warnings, the managerial memo that sanctioned alarm bypasses. Slowly, deliberately, their deliberations began to unfold. Words floated faintly back into the courtroom. Mention of missing inspection records, recollections of the union representative's warning, reluctant admissions that the factory worker had been pushed beyond protocol by forces far beyond his control. Minutes stretched into eternity as the jurors weighed fact against feeling, technical detail against human cost. When at last they reached consensus, the foreperson tapped the papers in front of her, a signal that reverberated like a tolling bell through the silent room. The judge called them forward one by one to collect the folded sheets, her robes whispering across the polished floor. Each hand that returned to the bailiff's table seemed steadier than the last, as if a burden had been lifted by the act of true consideration. When the final verdict form was handed up and unfolded under the judge's reading light, the courtroom held its breath. She cleared her throat and announced, in a voice both calm and weighty, that the defendant was found not guilty of manslaughter, but guilty of a lesser charge, reckless endangerment, acknowledging that a tragic oversight in factory maintenance had played a critical role in the outcome. Then, addressing the factory's management directly, she recommended a full safety audit and corrective measures to prevent future harm, censure to be recorded, and oversight from the State Industrial Board. A collective exhale rippled through the gallery. The defendant sank forward, relief and gratitude washing across his face. The factory manager, present in the courtroom, turned pale, his shoulders slumping beneath the realization that institutional failures could no longer hide behind individual blame. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every nuance for the next day's headlines. And as the gavel finally fell to signal recess, the courtroom seemed to realign itself around a new understanding. That justice had been served not by rigid adherence to procedure alone, but by the willingness to seek out every truth, however inconvenient. Moments later, Ethan stepped from the gallery into a corridor flooded with late afternoon light. Colleagues and friends approached, offering handshakes and tears of gratitude. A local reporter, voice trembling with excitement, asked him to describe what had just transpired. Ethan paused beneath a marble archway, gathering his thoughts. He spoke of the power of an engaged citizenry, of the duty to press for complete stories in service of fairness, and of the humility required to act on conviction even when the path is uncertain. His words echoed off the stone walls, carrying the same quiet authority that had moved the judge to reopen deliberations. When Ethan finally walked back out onto the courthouse steps, twilight had begun to settle across the town square. Streetlights flickered on, casting pools of amber across the cobblestones. He lingered, breathing deeply of the cool evening air, and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The mild-mannered teacher, who had once wondered whether he belonged in a jury box, had become the unlikely catalyst for a verdict that balanced accountability with compassion. In that cool dusk, he felt a kinship with the generations of jurors and citizens who had come before him, each entrusted with the weighty responsibility of upholding justice. As he descended the steps and merged into the flow of pedestrians making their way home, Ethan carried with him the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his voice, raised with reason, informed by detail and guided by principle, had truly shaken the courthouse and, in doing so, had reaffirmed the promise that every individual's perspective can matter when justice demands it.